So I'm Kelly. I'm the Director of Patient Strategy at Praxis. Most importantly, I have a child, a son with a DEE, and about 11 years ago, when he was diagnosed with an SCN2A mutation, I wanted to get into industry and work on treatments for his disease and other patients that are facing similar symptoms. I am not the only person at Praxis that has a child with a genetic epilepsy. There are several of us that work at Praxis. And what this means is we're bringing a sense of urgency on a daily basis into all of our work meetings and our programs. And we really understand the patient lived experience. We're living it ourselves too. At Praxis, we don't operate like a traditional pharmaceutical company. We're constantly breaking the status quo. And one example of that is we have not set up our Emerald trial or our Bold trial like a traditional clinical trial. We have figured out how to remove more burden of participating in a clinical trial from families, and we're bringing the clinical trial to the patient's home. And we'll touch on that quite a bit today. Praxis is an epilepsy company. So this is our pipeline, and all of these programs, except for one, are unique molecules or drug programs for some specific time of epilepsy. We have two different platforms at Praxis. One is a small molecule program, and this is relutragine, the drug we're going to be speaking about today, sits in this small molecule platform. We also have an antisense oligonucleotide or ASO platform, and these are gene-specific ASO treatments for different genetic epilepsies. And I know for me as a caregiver of a child with epilepsy, after trialing 3 or 4 different anti-seizure medications, and either they didn't work very well to reduce my son's seizure frequency, or some of the side effects were just as troublesome as the seizure frequency he was experiencing, I really lost a lot of hope that the 4th or 5th would be any different. But I really want to make it clear today that relutragine has a very different mechanism of action than anything else that's currently available. Relutragine is in the class of sodium channel blockers, but it is considered a sodium channel modulator. And what that means is it's selective to the hyperactive neuron. Most sodium channel blockers that are available, they block all sodium channels. Relutragine does not act in that mechanism. It works when the neuron is in a hyperactive state, and when neurons are functioning normally, it leaves those neurons untouched. With a lot of different anti-seizure medications, we have to slowly titrate up over a series of weeks or months to get to a therapeutic level and then assess if there's going to be efficacy. With relutragine, there's no titration whatsoever. So the dose that you start at is the dose that you stay at. And as a caregiver, you're going to be able to tell very early on if there's efficacy for your child on relutragine. The half-life is very long. It's about 5 days long. So that means this medication only has to be administered once per day. And the half-life is so long that even if you accidentally miss giving a dose on a particular day, it will not affect the levels. For this trial's purpose, relutragine is a liquid formulation, so it can be administered however the child takes the medication, either orally or by G or J tube. And there's no added sugars, so any patient that's on the ketogenic diet, relutragine is compatible. And we want to touch on the different phases in drug development that relutragine has been trialed in. We started in a phase 1 study, and this is a healthy volunteer study, so it's not necessarily a patient population. In our phase 1 study, we had 133 patients volunteer to be in this trial, and based on the safety data that came out of that phase 1 study, we were able to move into a phase 2 study of a specific patient population. We had our first cohort of SCN2A and SCN8A patients, and it was called the Bold study. When we did an interim analysis of that first cohort, The data was fantastic with regard to a safety profile and an efficacy profile. And so we ended up enrolling for a second cohort in the EMBOLD study. And we're going to touch on the data from both of those cohorts in a few slides. In parallel, a couple months ago, we opened a phase 3 registrational trial called Emerald for broader DEEs. And this is the last trial we will be running for relutragine. The time to a phase 3 study closing and going for a new drug application or commercialization to where a physician can actually write a prescription for a medication, best case scenario is a few years. So any families that are interested in trialing relutragine, this phase 3 Emerald trial would be your last opportunity to do so before this drug is potentially commercialized. And to touch on the data that came out of our EMBOLD trial. So when we did our very first interim analysis at the end of the double blind or at the end of 4 months, these were SCN2A and SCN8A patients that could remain on their anti-seizure medication regimen. So this means the best possible ASMs and then adding relutragine on top of that. When we looked at month 4, we saw an additional 46% seizure reduction once relutragine was added, and we were very excited by that at Praxis. When we did a second interim analysis at the 11-month mark, so patients on relutragine for 11 months, we saw a 90% seizure reduction. And this is really the opposite of what we see with a lot of anti-seizure medications, where there can be a honeymoon period initially, where there's efficacy, seizures reduce, and after a few weeks or even months, for whatever reason, the drug stops working as well, and the seizure frequency comes back as it was before. We did not see any severe adverse events due to relutragine during this study, and there were no patients that required a dose reduction of relutragine in this trial. And then our second cohort of EMBOLD was a much larger patient population. And when we did an interim analysis just in December last year, so this data is very new, we saw very similar results. So the majority of patients had gotten through the double blind. So we looked at the 4-month mark, and we saw a 53% seizure reduction and a 66% increase in motor seizure-free days. Seizures were our primary endpoint in EMBOLD, but we also utilized several different scales in this trial. And one of those scales is called the CGI, and we pulled out 4 specific domains. So we looked at disruptive behavior, and this is whatever that disruptive behavior is unique to the child. We looked at alertness or awareness. We looked at communication and seizure severity and intensity. So how often is rescue medication being used? Are the seizures clustering? How long are they lasting? This scale was administered on the day of screening, so the first day of the trial, and then utilized again at the end of the double blind or that 4-month mark. And it was administered to the caregiver as well as the principal investigator. And as you can see, there were significant improvements in all 4 domains. And I want to specifically call out alertness or awareness. So according to both the clinician and the caregiver, we're seeing a 78% improvement in alertness after 4 months. And this can be the opposite of what we see oftentimes when sodium channel blockers or anti-seizure medications are started, where patients can become potentially over-sedated or tired, or alertness decreases. So we were very excited with the results of this scale, and we're considering relutragine to have disease-modifying properties. It's affecting more than seizure control. And for our EMBOLD trial for our SCN2A and SCN8A patients, the FDA gave us breakthrough therapy designation based on the data that came out of EMBOLD. And what this means is the data that is emerging from relutragine for these patients had better efficacy and a better safety profile than any other alternatives currently available for these patients. So what that means is that the path to drug development speeds up for this molecule so that it can hopefully get to more patients that might need access to this medication. And we are expecting to do the same for our EMERALD trial for DEE patients. Relutragine has much broader applicability than just sodium channelopathies. So regardless of the root cause of your seizures, whether it's a mutation in STXBP1 or a syndrome diagnosis like LGS, there is hyperactivation in the sodium channels, which lead to causing seizures. And this is precisely where relutragine acts. So any neuron that's firing too fast or too often, this is where relutragine steps in and brings the neurons back to a normal state. We trialed relutragine in a pretty large library of different animal models. So we have our SCN2A and SCN8A mouse models. And then I want to specifically call out SCN1A or Dravet syndrome. Sodium channel blockers typically worsen seizure severity or seizure frequency. We saw the opposite here with relutragine, which further highlights the unique mechanism of action, again, being a sodium channel modulator, not a sodium channel blocker. And then we also trialed it in 4 other genetic epilepsy models. And I want to touch on the trial design for EMERALD. So we have options for families. Any family that wants to travel to a study site or might live locally by one of our study sites and wants to be seen in person at the clinical trial site, that option is available. But the majority of our families in EMBOLD and in EMERALD are choosing what we're calling the fully remote at-home option. And what this means is every single aspect of the clinical trial comes to the family in their home. You do not need to leave your home for any phase of the study or any study visit. So on the day of screening, what this means is a physician that's licensed in the patient's home state and a nurse come to the family's home, and labs are drawn out of the home. All of us assessments are administered in the home, and the principal investigator at the clinical trial site joins the visit by telehealth. For the next 28 days in the screening period, the caregiver is just filling out a daily electronic seizure diary. And at the end of those 28 days, if the patient has a minimum of 4 seizures and all of the labs are within normal range, then the patient is randomized into the trial. And what this means is there is a placebo group. It's randomized 1-to-1. So for 16 weeks, 50% of patients will be on placebo and 50% of patients will receive relutragine. There's a study visit once per month. Sometimes that study visit is with a nurse and the physician coming to your home, and always the principal investigator joining by telehealth. Sometimes it's just with a nurse. At the end of those 16 weeks, patients can roll into what's called the open label extension. And that just means there's no more placebo group. Every single patient is on relutragine. At the end of the open label extension, if any patient is seeing benefit on relutragine, we have an additional 3 years built into the protocol so that these patients can stay on relutragine until it would be commercially available or there's another mechanism for families to access this drug. So no one needs to worry if they're seeing benefit, they'll have to stop the drug at the end of the trial. We have an expanded access program in place so that you can remain on relutragine. And then to explain the way the at-home option works, it's still set up where the principal investigator is the doctor in charge during the study, overseeing the physician and the nurse that go to the patient's home and working closely with the patient's primary neurologist. The primary neurologist of the patient can be as involved in the trial as you, as the caregiver, want them to be. And we've had a lot of requests from families. All of the labs that are taken at different study visits, yes, those can absolutely be shared with the primary neurologist, or if there's any medication adjustment that happens during the trial, the PI can have conversations with the primary neurologist. We understand there's a lot of trust built with patients' care teams, and we want to involve them during the trial if that is your choice and how you want to operate here. And then with regard to who can participate in the Emerald trial, so anyone that has a DEE diagnosis, it's a pediatric through adult trial, so 2 years of age through to 65 at the time of screening. Seizure onset just has to happen by 12 years of age. Minimum of 4 motor seizures, and patients can remain on their anti-seizure medication regimen. No more than 2 of those anti-seizure medications can be true sodium channel blockers, but there's no cap on the number of total ASMs a patient can be taking. And then anyone that is interested in either screening and enrolling in Emerald or learning more, we have a trial-specific website, resilientstudies.com, and there's a page on Emerald with some of the information we reviewed here today. I would encourage any family that has some interest, you would pre-screen through the website with a nurse navigator. And what that means is you fill in a little bit of information on the website around seizure frequency, around age of the patient, and then assuming those 3 or 4 questions, the patient would be eligible for the trial. You're able to schedule a call with a nurse navigator at a time and a day that's convenient for you. And she would pre-screen your child for that study. So ask what medications they're on, what gene mutation or syndrome diagnosis they have. If the patient is eligible after that 10-15-minute call, then there's a transfer to a clinical trial study site. And the study site, the principal investigator and study coordinator will be reaching out to you within a couple days. And this is your opportunity to meet with the physician, the principal investigator on the study, to review the informed consent, to ask questions. If you would like the principal investigator at that time to connect with your child's primary neurologist, that ask is made often, and this study physician and your child's doctor can connect and really make sure that this is a good fit for your child.